for every woman who ever looked into the eyes of danger and felt something she couldn't name. The most dangerous prisons are the ones built from silk and obsession. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. Fiore Esposito noticed this the way she noticed most things, distantly, the way you notice background noise in a restaurant, present but unimportant. She had bigger problems than weather. She had a deposition at 7:30 the next morning, a client who wouldn't stop calling, and a senior partner breathing down her neck about the Marchetti contract that was supposed to have been finalized 2 weeks ago. She also had, apparently, very bad instincts about which bar to duck into during a Chicago downpour. The Velvet Anchor was the kind of place that looked respectable from the outside. Recessed lighting, a mahogany facade, a discreet brass plaque beside the door that could have belonged to a law firm or a private members' club. She'd walked past it 100 times on her way between her office and the parking garage, and she'd always assumed it was exactly what it appeared to be, an upscale cocktail bar for finance types and lawyers who needed somewhere to decompress before the commute home. She was wrong. She realized this the moment she pushed through the heavy door and stepped into the warm, amber interior. It was the quality of the silence more than anything else. Not the comfortable, prosperous silence of money at leisure, but something tighter. Something that had the specific texture of men who had stopped talking when she entered. Fiora paused just inside the door, rain dripping from her coat onto the dark hardwood floor. She was 31 years old, and she had learned, through necessity, to read rooms. This room said, "Leave." But it was raining harder now, and she was tired, and the bar was warm, and she told herself she was imagining things. Paranoia was an occupational hazard when you spent your days parsing the fine print of people's worst intentions. She moved toward the bar. The bartender, a wide, flat-faced man with the eyes of someone who had seen things and processed them all into the same neutral expression, watched her approach without blinking. She ordered a glass of Montepulciano and found a stool at the far end of the bar, closest to the back hallway where the restrooms presumably were. There were maybe 15 men in the bar. She catalogued them without appearing to. Older men, mostly, in good suits. No groups of friends. No one laughing. A few of them glanced at her with expressions she couldn't quite classify. Not predatory, not curious, but something more like alert. Like she was a variable they were calculating. She turned toward the Rain Street window, pulled out her phone, and opened the deposition notes. She was deep into the cross-examination strategy for the Marchetti case when she heard it. A single, sharp syllable, low and deliberate, spoken from somewhere down the back hallway. Then the sound of a door opening. Then footsteps. 2 sets, she thought, uneven, one of them reluctant. She didn't look up. She should have left. Even later, when she had time to replay it all, she understood that this was the moment, the still point where the entire axis of her life began to tilt. She should have paid for the wine she hadn't touched, pulled her coat on, and walked back out into the rain. She should have chosen wet over whatever was about to happen. Instead, she dropped her phone. It skittered off the edge of the bar stool and landed somewhere behind her, sliding toward the hallway. She swore under her breath and climbed down to retrieve it, rounding the small partition that separated the main bar area from the back corridor. The hallway was dim, lit by a single sconce that cast more shadow than light. Her phone had slid almost to the far end, near a door that stood partially open, and through that door, Fiora froze. Through that door, in what appeared to be a private dining room, three men stood around a fourth, who was seated and very clearly did not want to be. The seated man was middle-aged, sweat-soaked despite the chill, and his wrists were bound to the chair arms with what looked like zip ties. Two of the standing men she registered and immediately forgot. They were the type of men who were designed to be forgotten, all function and no feature. The third man she could not have forgotten if she tried for the rest of her life. He was standing with his back partially to the door, so she caught him in three-quarter profile, tall, black suit, the kind of stillness that took practice or a very particular temperament to achieve. Dark hair, close cut. She could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with the casual authority of someone who had never needed to perform power because he simply was it. He was speaking. She couldn't hear the words. Her blood was too loud in her ears, but she could see the effect of them on the seated man, who had begun to cry in the specific way of men who understand that crying is their last available option. Then the standing man reached inside his jacket. Fiora did not scream. That was the thing she would be most grateful for later. She did not scream, she did not gasp, she did not make a single sound. What she did was stumble backward, one step, involuntary, her heel catching the uneven floorboard with a sound like a small gunshot in the narrow hallway. The man in the black suit turned. His eyes found her in an instant. In the dim light they appeared dark, depthless, the colour of deep water over dark sand. They moved across her face with the efficiency of a scan, cataloguing, assessing, concluding, and she understood with absolute primitive certainty that she had made the worst mistake of her life. Behind her, the flat-faced bartender appeared. She heard him before she saw him, heard the soft sound of his footstep, and knew without turning that there was no way out. The man in the black suit said, quietly, to someone she couldn't see, "Bring her in." His name was Nero Falcone. She learned this the way she learned most things about him in those first hours, through inference, through the way other people spoke around him rather than to him, through the specific language of deference that surrounded him like a weather system. No one introduced him. No one needed to. He was simply the centre of every room he occupied, the point around which everything else organised itself. The private dining room was warmer than the hallway. She noticed this detail with the strange hyper-focus that she would later understand was shock, beginning its particular reorganisation of priorities. Warm, dark wood panelling, a table set for no one, crystal glasses glinting in the low light. The seated man, whose crying had stopped with the same abruptness as a radio switching off, was no longer looking at her. Two men she didn't know were standing behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she understood movement was not an option. Nero Falcone stood perhaps 6 feet away and regarded her with an expression she could not read. That was the thing that unsettled her most, beyond the fear and the sharp animal instinct toward self-preservation. She was very good at reading faces, professionally good, and his face gave her nothing. He was younger than she'd initially thought, early 40s perhaps, the kind of man whose age registered as authority rather than chronology. He was handsome in a way that felt like an afterthought, dark features assembled with a sculptor's precision, but worn with complete indifference to their effect. "Your name?" he said, not a question. She noticed that too. Everything he said seemed to arrive already fully formed, a statement of what would happen, rather than an inquiry about what she preferred. "I need you to let me go." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Years of courtroom work, she supposed, learning to speak calmly into the face of opposition. His expression did not change. "Your name," he said again. "I'm a lawyer." She tried this instead. "I work 2 blocks from here. My firm knows where I am." She didn't know why she said this. Her firm had no idea where she was. "And if I don't—" "I know you're a lawyer," he said. He moved, not toward her, but sideways, a slow repositioning, the way a chess piece slides along a rank. She tracked him without meaning to. "Fiora Esposito, associate at Benedetti and Cole, graduated top of your class from Northwestern, did 2 years at the DA's office before you moved to private practice." He paused. "Your phone is unlocked. People are careless." She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He had looked at her phone in the 60 seconds it had taken them to bring her into this room. He had a team who could look up a name in 60 seconds. "What you saw," he said, stopping his sideways movement and facing her directly, "was a private conversation." "I didn't see anything." This was technically true. She had heard and inferred, and the logical architecture of what she'd been building since the moment she stepped into the hallway was something she was not about to articulate aloud. Something moved in his eyes. Not amusement exactly, something colder that occupied the same space. "You're either very smart or very foolish," he said. "I'm a lawyer. I'm both." The words came out before she could stop them. She watched his expression, a fractional shift, almost too small to register, and she realized with disorienting clarity that she had surprised him, that not many things surprised this man. Behind him, the 2 other men in the room had become invisible. He had that quality. He made everything else recede. She hated that she noticed it. "Here is the situation," Nero Falcone said. He had a slight accent, Italian underneath the Chicago flat vowels, layered and barely perceptible, the kind that came not from recent immigration, but from a household where 2 languages lived simultaneously. "You witnessed something. What you think you witnessed and what actually occurred may be different, but your perception is the problem, not the reality. You're a liability. You understand that." Again, not a question, a statement, a problem he was identifying before solving. "So you're going to kill me?" She heard her own voice say this with perfect steadiness, and felt briefly proud of herself, and immediately ridiculous for feeling proud at a moment like this. "No." He said it simply, and somehow this was the most frightening thing he'd said yet, because it implied something she hadn't considered. He pulled out a chair from the dining table, the gesture unhurried, courteous in its way, and sat down, looked at her. "Sit." "I'd rather stand." That wasn't an offer. She sat. He leaned back slightly, studying her. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Brown eyes, she could see now, dark brown, with an almost amber quality at the centre, like light trapped in dark wood. The kind of eyes that noticed too much. Killing you creates problems, he said, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious. You're a lawyer. Your disappearance creates interest, investigation, interest in this bar, in this neighborhood, in affairs that don't benefit from interest. He paused. But allowing you to leave creates a different problem. I told you. I know what you told me. He was still watching her with that same dispassionate assessment. You're intelligent enough to construct a convincing argument for why you wouldn't go to the police, and you may even believe it. But I've lived long enough to understand that human behavior under pressure is the most unpredictable variable in any equation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word arrived with the weight of someone who had never needed to perform authority. So what is this? Fiora asked. What happens to me? He looked at her for a long moment. The rain was audible even through the walls, steady and relentless. You come with me, he said, until I've decided what to do. They took her coat, her phone, her bag, her keys, and her dignity. Not all at once, and not cruelly, which in some ways was worse than cruelty. If they'd been brutal about it, she would have had something to push against. Instead, a woman appeared, compact, composed, silver-streaked hair, the precise manner of a senior executive, and simply held out her hand, and somehow the natural grammar of the gesture made refusing it feel childish. The woman's name, apparently, was Rosa. She spoke to Fiora in a tone that was not unkind, explained that her belongings would be kept safe, that she should come this way, please, and that Mr. Falcone's car was waiting. I'm not going anywhere, Fiora said. Rosa looked at her with the patience of someone who had been saying yes, but actually no, for many years. Of course, she said, in a tone that meant, we both know better. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows and leather seats that smelled of cedar and expensive things. Nero Falcone sat in the front, not looking at her. Two men she would mentally classify as security flanking sat on either side of her in the back. They were professionally blank, neither threatening nor reassuring. She spent the drive cataloguing information. 23 minutes. North on Lakeshore Drive, the dark water of Lake Michigan barely visible through the rain. Turn west, then north again, into a neighborhood she recognized as the Gold Coast. Money so old here it had calcified into architecture, limestone facades and wrought iron gates, and the particular silence of streets that didn't need to announce their expensiveness. The car descended into a private underground garage. Elevator. The kind with a key panel, not floor buttons. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor. She stepped out of the elevator and stopped. She had been to nice apartments before. She had clients who lived well. But this was something else entirely. Not the flashiness of new money or the careful curation of someone assembling a life from a magazine, but something that looked like it had evolved organically from the specific tastes of one very particular person. Dark wood floors, Persian rugs that were probably older than the building, floor-to-ceiling windows that made the rain-lit city look like a painting. Art on the walls that she couldn't catalogue quickly, but that all had the quality of things acquired because they meant something, rather than because they were impressive. And books, everywhere. Built-in shelves lining an entire wall of the main room, filled with books that had the worn spines of things actually read rather than displayed. She hated that she noticed this. She hated that anything about this man's space could register as interesting or human, when he had just had her taken from a bar against her will. Rosa led her down a hallway, a bedroom, a guest room clearly, tastefully furnished, a bathroom attached. "There are clothes in the wardrobe that should fit," Rosa said. "Mr. Falcone will speak with you in the morning. I want to speak with him now." Rosa looked at her with the expression of someone who found this charming. "Good night, Miss Esposito." The door closed. Fiora heard no lock turn, which either meant they trusted the circumstances to contain her, or they knew she was smart enough to understand that trying to leave would be pointless. She tested the window. It opened onto a 20-story drop and a wind that would peel the skin off her face. She sat on the edge of the bed and made herself breathe. All right. She ran through it like a brief. Facts first. She was a lawyer kidnapped by. She sorted through what she knew, what she'd inferred, what the evidence of the last 2 hours suggested. A man who was clearly at the top of something organized and dangerous. He hadn't hurt her. His stated logic for not killing her was actually coherent, which was either reassuring or more frightening than the alternative. She had no phone, no way to contact anyone, no knowledge of what she'd actually witnessed, beyond the impressionistic collage of a dim room and a restrained man and a hand reaching inside a jacket. She stood, went to the window, and looked at the city spread below her in the rain. Somewhere down there, her apartment, her cat, her assistant Asher, who would call when Fiora missed the morning meeting and get no answer. How long before someone looked? Long enough, she supposed. She was single, lived alone. Her parents were in Naples. She had friends in the city, but not the kind who would immediately call the police at a missed check-in. She worked in a world of busy people who assumed busy explanations for silence. She had time, was what she was telling herself, time and her brain, which was the best tool she'd ever had access to. And she had never yet met a situation she couldn't think her way through. She repeated this to herself with more conviction than she felt, and eventually fell asleep, still wearing her rain-damp suit, curled on top of the covers with her shoes on, because sleeping with your shoes on felt like a small resistance she could manage. In the morning, the shoes were gone, and someone had covered her with a blanket. She couldn't decide whether to be unsettled by this or grateful, and the ambivalence itself unsettled her more than either feeling alone would have. He was already in the kitchen when she found it. This surprised her. Not that he was awake, but the kitchen specifically. It was large and functional in the way of rooms that were actually used, copper pots hanging from a rack above the island, fresh herbs in small pots on the windowsill, a coffee machine that looked like it required an engineering degree. He was standing at the stove with a small espresso cup and what appeared to be a newspaper, actual newsprint, folded to the business section, and he looked utterly at home in a way she hadn't expected from a man who existed at the centre of violence. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway, looked at her. She'd found clothes in the wardrobe as promised, a cashmere sweater and soft trousers in precisely her size, which was its own category of disturbing, and then looked back at the newspaper. "Coffee," he said. Not an offer, a statement of fact about what was available. She poured it herself because accepting service from him felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. The coffee was extraordinary, which was deeply inconvenient. "I want to know exactly what happens to me," she said, sitting across the kitchen island from him. The morning light was different up here, broader, the city laid out pale and washed clean by last night's rain. Not later, now. He folded the newspaper with precise motions. You're safe. For the duration of the current situation, you'll remain here. The current situation. There were people who would use you against me if they knew you existed, he said. You walked into that bar. You saw enough to be valuable as leverage, even if you didn't understand what you saw. Until that concern is resolved, moving you is a risk I'm not willing to take. Fiora studied him. In the morning light, he looked slightly different. No less formidable, but more dimensional. The dark suit of last night had been replaced with dark trousers and a shirt with the collar open, sleeves rolled below the elbow. She could see a partial tattoo on his left forearm, something that disappeared beneath the fabric. She caught a wing, a claw, something serpentine. People who would use me, she said. Your enemies. Everyone in my business has enemies. What business is that, exactly? She kept her voice careful, academic, as if she were taking a deposition rather than sitting across a kitchen island from a man who had her removed from a bar because she dropped her phone at the wrong moment. He looked at her directly. You know what business it is. She did. The bar, the men, the way everyone moved, the specific quality of deference. She had grown up in the daughter of an Italian father who had come to Chicago in the 70s and built a small construction business that no one in the family ever discussed too specifically. She had grown up knowing, by molecular osmosis, the shape of a certain kind of power structure. She had gone to law school specifically to stand on the other side of that structure. How long? She asked. A week, perhaps 2. She felt the specific horror of this settle into her chest. A week, 2. Asher would call. Her clients would call. The Marchetti deposition was tomorrow morning, and she had no way to be there. And if she wasn't there... My clients, she started, will be contacted. A family emergency. Your assistant has already been given a message. He said this without inflection, as if it were logistics, as if her life were a scheduling problem he'd solved before breakfast. She stared at him. You called my office. Rosa did. This is... She stopped, pressed her lips together. She had been about to say illegal, which was so dramatically insufficient a word for the situation that she almost laughed. You can't just... And yet, he said, not unkindly. Fiora put both hands flat on the countertop and focused on the cool smoothness of the marble. She was furious. She could feel it moving through her in waves, clean and bracing. And she was also afraid, which she was refusing to allow to the front, because fear was not useful here. I'm going to need to work, she said, when she felt composed enough. If I disappear for 2 weeks, I lose clients. I have ongoing cases. I need access to my files and my email. He watched her. This was something she was already learning about him, the way he registered information with his eyes rather than his face, so that his face told her nothing, while she had the distinct sense that very little escaped his notice. I'll arrange a laptop, he said finally. Limited access. What does limited mean? It means what you need to maintain your work, without the ability to communicate my location or yours. She wanted to argue with this, but recognized the framework was more than she'd expected to get. She filed it as a partial victory. And I want to know what you said to my assistant. That you have a family emergency in Italy, and you'll be in contact when you can. He picked up his espresso. It's plausible. You have family in Naples. She felt the cold of it again. how thoroughly he'd looked at her phone, or how thoroughly someone had briefed him in the time between the bar and the penthouse. "You know a lot about me," she said. He looked at her over the rim of the small cup. "I know everything about everyone in my immediate environment. It's not personal." Something about this, delivered with such complete matter-of-factness, made the fear flicker and a strange, inappropriate amusement spark in its place. "Not personal," she repeated. "Does that bother you?" "Being kidnapped bothers me. The particulars are secondary." And there it was again, that almost invisible shift in his expression, that fractional movement she was beginning to catalogue as the closest thing he had to surprise. She was interesting to him, she realised. Not in any way she welcomed, but she was a variable he hadn't expected. "Eat something," he said, and pushed a plate of sliced fruit and a piece of bread toward her. "You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon." She didn't ask how he knew this. She ate the bread because she was starving, and because eating was also a small act of control. Then she looked at him across the counter and said, quietly and precisely, "I will find a way out of this." Nero Falcone looked at her with those dark, amber eyes. "I know," he said simply. "I'm counting on it to keep things interesting." By the fourth day, she had mapped the penthouse the way she mapped an unfamiliar courtroom, not obsessively, but precisely. 4,200 square feet, 4 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, a kitchen large enough to constitute a professional operation, a study that was kept locked, which she'd tested once out of principle, a room she thought of as the war room. She never saw inside it, but men came and went through it throughout the day, with the purposeful energy of people managing something ongoing. A terrace that ran the south and east sides of the building, currently cold but present, accessible through the main room's glass doors. She also mapped the people. Rosa was the axis around which the domestic operation rotated. Efficient, warm in the way of professional warmth, quietly implacable. She answered some of Fiora's questions and redirected others with such seamless grace that Fiora often didn't realize she'd been redirected until later. She brought food at regular intervals, arranged the laptop that arrived on day 2, a clean machine, obviously, with specific access controls that Fiora spent the better part of an evening trying to circumvent before acknowledging defeat, and maintained the particular fiction that Fiora was a guest rather than a prisoner by never saying anything that acknowledged the reality directly. There was Marco, young, 20-something, with a jaw that would have been handsome if he ever relaxed it, who stood near the elevator and responded to her attempts at conversation with monosyllables that were not unfriendly, just minimal. There was Carla, who cleaned, and who definitely knew more than she let on, based on the quality of her studied incuriosity. And there was Nero. He was there in the mornings, always up before her, always in the kitchen or on the terrace with coffee and whatever he was reading or thinking. He was there in the evenings, sometimes. During the day he disappeared into the locked study or left entirely, and when he left, a different quality of air came into the apartment. Not relief, exactly, but a loosening of something she hadn't consciously realized was held tight. When he was present, she was aware of him in the specific way of an approaching weather system. Even in another room, even when she couldn't see him, there was a quality of attention she could sense. Not surveillance exactly, though surveillance was certainly happening through other means, but something more particular than that. On the 4th evening he came into the main room where she was working, actually working, cross-referencing case documents with the careful eye of someone performing triage, and sat on the opposite end of the long leather sofa without comment. He had a glass of whiskey she hadn't heard him pour, and a book whose cover she couldn't see, and he simply read. She waited for him to say something. When he didn't, she went back to her documents. They sat in silence for an hour. It was the strangest hour of her captivity, because it was also, in a way she fiercely resented acknowledging, not unpleasant. She was a person who liked quiet, who found other people's noise exhausting, and his silence was, peculiarly, not intrusive. It had the quality of someone whose presence you could coexist with. "What are you reading?" She didn't know why she asked. She hadn't intended to. He turned the book toward her. The Leopard, by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa. Italian, she thought, of course. "Have you read it?" he asked. "In school, my father made me." "Your father had good taste." He went back to the book. She watched him for a moment, the way his eyes moved across the page with genuine focus, the loose angle of his shoulders that was as relaxed as she'd seen him, the whiskey glass balanced on one knee, and then made herself look away. "Tell me about the man in the chair," she said. His eyes didn't move from the book. "No." "Was he alive when I left?" A pause. She could see him deciding something. "Yes," he said. She breathed through this. "What did you do to him?" Now he looked up, those dark eyes across the length of the sofa between them. "I had a conversation with him. He was restrained because he was not likely to sit still for a conversation otherwise." "And the gun?" A pause, longer than the others. There was no gun. She thought about this, ran through the frame of what she'd actually seen, the reaching inside the jacket, the angle, what she could and couldn't confirm. She was a lawyer. She knew the difference between what a witness sees and what they think they see. "What was it?" she asked. He studied her for a moment. Then, unhurriedly, he reached into his own jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out toward her. She stood and crossed the distance to take it, the closest she'd been to him since that first night, and she was aware of this, of the warmth of his presence at close range, of the way he watched her hand take the paper from his. She unfolded it. A document, numbers, account references, something financial. She couldn't decode the specifics quickly, but understood the general architecture. "The conversation I was having," he said, "was about money that belonged to other people." She handed the paper back. He didn't take it immediately. Their fingers were adjacent for a moment, not touching. She stepped back. "That's not as clean as you're making it sound," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He said this with the even candor of someone who didn't need things to be clean, who had made peace long ago with the particular moral landscape he occupied. She went back to the sofa, picked up her document, set it down again. "Do you know what you are?" she said, not looking at him. "Yes," he said. "Do you?" She looked at him then. He was watching her over the top of The Leopard with that dark, attentive gaze. She had the sudden sense that this question was not what it appeared to be, that it was him asking her something else entirely, something beneath the words, something she wasn't ready to answer. "Good night," she said, and gathered her papers and went to her room. She sat on the bed in the dark and told herself that she was not thinking about him. She was almost convincing. On the 6th day, Someone tried to get in. She was in the kitchen around midnight. She couldn't sleep, kept replaying the deposition she was missing and the fraying edges of her practice, when the sound reached her. Not dramatic, a sequence of tones from what appeared to be a panel near the elevator, followed by a specific quality of silence, followed by voices in another part of the apartment, low and quick. She stood very still. The voices moved through the walls the way sounds do in large buildings, directional but muffled, all urgency and no content. Then one of them, she realized, was Nero. She knew his voice now in the specific way you learn voices that have authority over your circumstances, lower than the others, unhurried even in whatever was happening. She moved to her doorway and looked into the hallway. Marco was at the far end, speaking quietly into a phone. He clocked her immediately and held up one hand, not threatening, just, "Stay there." Then Nero appeared from the direction of the war room. He dressed quickly, she could see, the shirt untucked, jacket thrown on, and he was carrying something in his right hand with the complete, unself-conscious ease of someone for whom carrying it was unremarkable. She registered. A gun, matte black, already in his grip without being aimed at anything. Her heart hit the inside of her ribs once, sharply. He saw her and stopped. Something passed through his face, something that was not the expression he had for most things. Faster, less controlled, gone in an instant. "Go back inside your room," he said. "What's happening?" "Inside. Now." He said it quietly, and the quiet was somehow more imperative than shouting would have been. She went back inside. She heard footsteps, multiple sets, coordinated, and the specific sounds of whatever was happening being managed. It lasted 40 minutes, during which she sat on her bed and did not read, did not think about the deposition, thought instead about the expression that had crossed his face when he'd seen her standing in the hallway doorway. Something protective. She'd analysed it in the moment and then refused the analysis because the analysis was inconvenient. But there it was. Something in him had shifted when he saw her standing there exposed, something that was not calculated or political, but immediate and instinctive, and she did not know what to do with this information. At 1 in the morning he knocked on her door. She almost didn't say "come in," and then she said it, because she wanted, needed to know. He stood in the doorway. No gun visible now. His face had resumed its usual quality of careful control, but there was a residue of something around the edges. Not fear, she didn't think he experienced that in any form she'd recognize, but alertness still running a little hot. "There was a threat," he said, "credible but contained. It's resolved." "Contained how?" He looked at her for a moment. "The way things in my world are contained." She absorbed this. "Was it because of me? Someone found out?" "No, this was unrelated to you. Pre-existing business." She nodded. She was still sitting on the bed, dressed because she'd never properly undressed, and he was standing in the doorway, and the space between them felt different than it usually did, more charged. The residual adrenaline of whatever had happened still moving in the air between them. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her as if she'd said something in a language he recognized but rarely heard. "Yes." "Does anyone ever ask you that?" A long pause. "No." "That sounds lonely," she said, without thinking, without strategy. She watched him absorb this, the fractional thing in his expression, not surprise exactly, Not anymore. She'd surprised him enough times that he'd adjusted the calibration, but something more exposed, like she'd found a seam in the armor and pressed gently. "Sleep," he said. "You're safe." He pulled the door closed before she could say anything else. She stared at the dark wood of it for a long time. The next morning she found a single red rose on the kitchen island when she came down for coffee. No note. Rosa said nothing about it. Marco looked studiously at the middle distance. Nero was already in his study. She put the rose in the glass with the herbs on the windowsill and told herself it meant nothing. Then she spent the better part of an hour catching herself looking at it. She was losing her mind. That was the rational explanation. Stockholm Syndrome had an established psychological basis, and she was a highly educated person who could recognize the mechanism for what it was. Trauma bonding, transference of agency, the mind's tendency to find connection in confinement. This was textbook, and she was smart enough to know it, and knowing it would protect her. She drank her coffee and looked at the rose and did not feel protected. He came out of the study at noon and found her at the kitchen island with her laptop. He poured coffee, leaned against the counter at an angle that was not quite facing her and not quite turned away. "You said lonely," he said. She looked up. "What?" "Last night. You said it sounds lonely." He was looking at the window, the city bright and cold and distant beyond the glass. "Why did you say that?" She considered her answer carefully. "Because you're the center of everything in this apartment, and nothing is directed at you. Everyone waits for you to speak. No one asks you anything. You receive information. You don't volunteer it." "That's not—" She stopped. "That's not a relationship with other humans. That's a position." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him processing. This was something she'd learned about him, that he processed things thoroughly before responding, that his silences were not absence, but presence. "You're very observant," he said finally. "I'm a lawyer. You keep saying that. It keeps being relevant." He looked at her then, directly, with the full force of those amber dark eyes, and said, "It's been that way for a long time. Long enough that I don't register it as lack." She held his gaze. "But you registered what I said." A pause. Then, almost to himself, "Yes, I did." On the 8th day, he took her somewhere. This itself was a surprise. She'd begun to understand the penthouse as the totality of her available world, a gilded but finite space, and the idea of going outside it, even under armed escort, had the strange excitement of novelty that she recognized as a symptom of confinement. "Where are we going?" she asked in the elevator. "Out." He was in a dark coat, a scarf at his throat that she noticed without meaning to, cashmere, navy, the kind of detail that revealed the precise level at which he lived. "You haven't left the apartment in 8 days. Rosa tells me you haven't been sleeping." "Rosa tells you things about me." "She tells me what I need to know to keep you healthy." He said this without particular inflection, and she couldn't tell whether it was cold or caring or simply functional. "So this is welfare management." He looked sideways at her in the elevator. "This is a gallery." The car took them to River North, the art district, galleries tucked between restaurants, the particular mix of aesthetic and commerce that Chicago did quietly and well. The gallery they entered was small and exclusive, and the woman who met them at the door knew Nero by name and showed them in with the specific warmth that money and authority produce. The exhibition was photographs, black and white, large format, architectural, Sicilian villages, coastline, ancient walls. She walked through the rooms and felt them as physical things, the salt air implied in the grain of the images, the quality of light that was unlike Chicago light. Nero moved through the gallery with a different quality than he moved through his penthouse. Slower, more open. He stopped in front of a large print of a cliff face above the sea, somewhere in the south, she could tell from the quality of the rock, and looked at it with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something almost private. "You're from Sicily," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father was from Palermo, my mother from Chicago. I grew up between them." He looked at the photograph. "I haven't been back in 12 years. She almost asked why. She could see from the set of his shoulders that the 12 years held something she would not be told. Instead, she said, "My father is from Napoli. I went back once when I was 9, and I understood for the first time why Italian food in America is always a little sad." He looked at her then, and the corner of his mouth moved, barely, the most minimal suggestion of a smile, but it changed his face completely, made him suddenly and devastatingly human. She turned away before she could take it too fully in. They moved through the gallery in a silence that felt different from all the other silences, less like containment and more like company. She noticed that Marco and another man she didn't know were positioned at the gallery's entrance and exit, visible if you looked, invisible if you didn't. The gallery's other visitors, 4 of them scattered, moved around them with the unconscious deference that powerful men in well-fitted clothes produce without effort. At the far end of the gallery, before a photograph of a woman standing on a rooftop with the sea behind her, Nero stopped beside her. "Why law?" he asked. Not the way someone makes conversation, but the way someone who wants to know asks a question. She looked at the woman in the photograph. "My father's world was," she hesitated, "adjacent to yours." She felt him still beside her. "Not directly," she added carefully. He ran a construction company, legitimate, I think, mostly. But the world he moved in, the people around it, I grew up knowing what certain things looked like, what they meant." She paused. "I went to law school because I wanted to be on the side of the ledger that had rules, structure, something you could point to and say, 'This is the line.' And now you're here," he said quietly. "Now I'm here." She exhaled. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "Something cruder, less—" She stopped herself. "Less what?" She shook her head. She wasn't going to say less human. She wasn't going to say less like someone I could talk to. She wasn't going to say any of the things she was actually thinking, because she had enough self-awareness to recognize the slippage that was happening, the way he had begun to feel less like a threat and more like a presence, and the way this was both the most dangerous possible development and, in some molecular, treacherous way, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in years. "Less complicated," she said finally. He looked at her. The gallery was quiet around them, the photographs on the walls like windows into another world. "You thought the man who had you taken from a bar was simple," he said. "I thought the man who had me taken from a bar was simply dangerous. There's a difference." He was very close. She hadn't noticed them drifting to this proximity, but here it was, a foot of space between them, close enough to catch the cedar and something scent of him, close enough to see the precise darkness of his eyes in the gallery's clean white light, close enough that this felt like something she was choosing rather than something happening to her. She stepped back. He let her. "We should go," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another 5 seconds, which she counted, which she refused to attach meaning to. Then they turned and walked back through the gallery, and Marco fell into step behind them, and the car was warm, and on the ride home she sat very still and watched Chicago move past the window, and told herself that the gallery had been beautiful, and that was all there was to it. On the 10th day, she heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. She had developed the habit of early mornings, earlier than Nero, which took effort, since he seemed barely to sleep, sitting on the east end of the terrace, wrapped in a blanket, with the laptop and coffee, working while the city assembled itself below. It was cold, but not cruelly so, and the privacy of it, the illusion of being outside the walls, even while still contained within them, had become important to her. She was on the terrace when he came out of the study with someone she'd never seen before. A man, older, thick-set, with white hair and the kind of build that had once been imposing and was now just substantial. They came into the main room. She could see them through the glass. They couldn't see her in the early morning shadow of the terrace, and their conversation was inaudible until Nero opened the glass door slightly, the way you do for air without intention. She didn't move. She kept her eyes on her laptop. "Conti's people are making noise on the south side. 3 of ours." "I know." Nero's voice, flat and careful. "The Marchetti family," the older man said, and Fiora went very still. "Marchetti." "Think they can use the situation, the contract. That's not their contract. Tell them that. They've been circling it for months. Word is they knew about the bar, that no one told them about the bar." "Nero." The older man's voice shifted, went careful. "If they knew about what happened there, if someone talks, no one is going to talk." His voice had dropped, not louder, but heavier. "And the girl doesn't know enough to be useful to them, even if they found her." She exhaled very, very quietly. The girl. She was the girl. Of course she was. She was a liability in a ledger of liabilities, and the warmth she'd been carefully not acknowledging from the gallery, from the rose, from the particular quality of his silences. It was all contaminated now by the word. The girl, the situation, the variable in an equation. She had known this. She had told herself she knew this. Knowing it and hearing it articulated were different experiences. If Conti's people move on any of ours before the summit, they won't. Nero moved, and the draft changed, and the voices dropped back below her ability to parse them, and she sat on the cold terrace and looked at the pale morning city and felt something she recognized after a moment as grief. Not grief for any specific thing. Grief for the slippage she'd been allowing without fully admitting it. For the 10 days she'd spent learning a man she should have been finding a way to escape. For the realization that she was better at this enforced proximity, this strange intimacy, than she was at her actual life. She went inside before he saw her. She was very professional about it for the rest of the day. She worked on the Marchetti case, the irony of which she noted with a private, humourless laugh, and answered client emails through the restricted channels Rosa had arranged, and ate lunch at the kitchen island, and if her eyes skimmed over the rose in the herb glass with something she was no longer willing to call warmth, she managed that too. In the evening, he found her in the main room. "You're different today," he said. He said it without preamble, the way he said most things. "I'm the same." "You're not." He sat in the chair across from the sofa where she was working, and she felt the weight of his attention in the specific way she'd come to recognize, not surveillance, but notice. The difference being that surveillance was about data and notice was about a person. She looked up from the laptop. "I heard some of your conversation this morning, on the terrace." She watched his face for the usual controlled blankness. It didn't come immediately. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where something moved in his expression, and she catalogued it without being able to name it. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," she paused. "The Marchetti family is one of my clients." A long silence. "I know," he said. She closed the laptop. "Is that why you haven't let me go? Is there something you want from me that has to do with that case?" He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone engaged rather than dismissive. "No, I told you why you're here. It has nothing to do with Marchetti, and nothing to do with your practice. You are in the wrong place." She looked at him steadily. "I heard you say, 'the girl,' this morning." He was very still. "Is that what I am?" she asked. Not accusatory. She was genuinely asking. "A variable you're managing?" He stood, and she tensed instinctively, and then he was crossing the room in 3 slow strides and sitting on the other end of her sofa, not close, but the same surface, same latitude, and saying quietly, "No." "Then what?" He was looking at his hands for a moment, and this was the first time she'd seen him look at something other than whatever he was focused on. The first time she'd seen something like hesitation. "You are the most unexpected thing that has happened in this apartment in years," he said. "And I am not someone accustomed to unexpected things." She studied his profile, the clean line of it, the shadows the lamp threw, the way he sat as if he'd grown out of wherever he was, rooted. "Nero." She used his name for the first time. It came out lower than she intended. He looked at her. "The situation you keep referring to," she said, "when it ends, what happens to me?" He held her gaze for a long time, long enough to feel like something was being said beneath the silence, something that hadn't found its words yet. "You go back to your life," he said. "Exactly as it was." She didn't know why this felt like a loss. She absolutely refused to examine why this felt like a loss. She nodded, looked back at the closed laptop, and said, "All right." He sat there for another hour. Neither of them said anything. The city moved in the windows. Outside, something was always happening in his world, and tonight, for an hour, he sat on the edge of her sofa and let something else happen instead. The call came on the 12th day, and it shattered things. She was in her room when she heard it, not the call itself, but its aftermath, the rapid percussion of footsteps and the change in air pressure that meant multiple people moving urgently through a space designed for the opposite. She opened her door and found the hallway different. Two men she'd never seen, positioned at intervals, and Marco's face carrying the tight, specific expression of someone managing bad information. "What happened?" she asked. "Stay in your room, Miss Esposito." She stayed in the hallway. "What happened?" Rosa appeared from the direction of the main room, and her face, usually smooth with professional composure, was carrying something strained. "There's been an incident," she said. "Please, just where is he?" She heard herself ask this, and noted from a distance that she had moved from Falcone to he in her interior grammar without noticing when. "He's fine," Rosa said, and Fiora exhaled. "But he's occupied. Please, Fiora." The first name. Rosa used it when she wanted her compliance, she'd learned. She went back to her room and sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling and waited. It was 3 hours before she heard his footsteps in the hallway, unhurried as always because he did nothing in a hurry. Her door was open. He stopped in the doorway. He had blood on his shirt. A dark stain on the left shoulder, already dried and oxidized. He was otherwise uninjured as far as she could see, and she ran her eyes over him with the specific attention of someone checking for damage, and hated herself mildly for the relief when she found none. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He looked down at the shirt briefly, as if he'd forgotten about it. "Not mine." She stood, crossed to him before she'd fully decided to, and stood in front of him in the doorway, closer than she'd been since the gallery, looking at him, looking at the shirt, the set of his jaw, the thing in his eyes that was not quite controlled right now, that was running a half-degree warmer than his standard. "Whose?" she asked. A pause. "Someone who is being looked after." "One of yours?" "Yes." He said it quietly. Protective. The word is carrying something it wouldn't have 10 days ago. She put her hand on his arm. The right arm, not the blood-stained side, just her hand, flat on the dark fabric of his sleeve, in a gesture that wasn't calculated, that came from somewhere she'd been trying not to acknowledge. She felt him still beneath the contact. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something passed through his expression, something that moved too quickly for her to fully catalogue, but that had the quality of a door opening. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was different, lower, she thought. "You should too." She paused. "Do you? Actually sleep?" "Occasionally." The ghost of that almost smile, there and gone. She removed her hand. She hadn't realized until the removal how present the contact had been, how much information the touch had carried, warmth and solidity, and something she was going to spend the rest of the night not naming. She stepped back into her room. He stayed in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at her with that quality of attention that had by now become completely particular to her, that she had come to recognize as his, the specific frequency on which Nero Falcone noticed things. "I need you to understand something," he said. She waited. "The situation has become complicated." He said it carefully, as if choosing each word while simultaneously knowing they were insufficient. "There are people who have become aware that I have a liability. Someone close to me told a story they shouldn't have." His voice stayed level, but she heard what was beneath it, controlled fury, cold and total. This means your profile has changed. Staying here is more important now, not less. I'm in more danger, she said, stating it plainly. You're safe here. His voice on safe had a different quality. Absolute. Final. As if safety were a thing he could decree into existence through sheer will. And she believed, with some portion of herself that bypassed rational analysis, that he could. And if I try to leave? She asked. I will find you. He said this not as a threat, but as a declaration of fact, the same tone in which he said everything, as a statement of the world as it would be. Within the hour. She looked at him. I believe you. Good. He straightened. Sleep, Fiora. He used her name. She processed this after he was gone, lying in the dark, wide awake, acutely conscious of the fact that this was the first time he'd said her name, that it had arrived in his voice with a specific weight, a care, a quality she was not going to attach a label to, because any label she could reach for was one she absolutely could not afford. She slept eventually, and when she slept, she dreamed of Sicilian coastline and dark eyes and a man who blocked out everything behind him the way a cliff does the sea. On the 14th day, he made dinner. She came into the kitchen at 7 and found him there, actually at the stove, actually cooking, in a state that reconfigured her understanding of him in some fundamental way that she was probably going to regret. The black jacket was gone, his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and she could see more of the tattoo now. She'd been right about a wing, something raptor, darker, coiling lines beneath it. He moved around the kitchen with the same economy he moved everywhere, no wasted motion. The kitchen smelled of garlic and tomato and something with wine, and for the first time since the bar she felt not imprisoned or threatened or confused, but simply hungry, in a way that was about more than food. You cook, she said, stating the impossible. He glanced at her over his shoulder. You sound shocked. I am shocked. My grandmother. He turned back to whatever was on the stove. She was the kind of woman who believed that not knowing how to cook was a character defect. She made no distinct between her grandsons and her granddaughters on this point. A pause. She was right. She sat at the island and watched him. She had a glass of wine, he'd poured it without asking, which she'd given up objecting to, because his habit of knowing what she wanted before she asked was one of those things that was difficult to sustain irritation about. The wine was very good, which was also not surprising. Tell me about her, Fiora said. He stirred something. The question sat in the air a moment before he decided what to do with it. She was small, 5 feet exactly. She had opinions about everything, and she expressed them without apology. He paused. She died when I was 17. I've never eaten anything as good as what she made, and I've eaten in places that would cost you a month's salary. What was her name? Lucia. He said it with a quality that was different from everything else, softer, more private. She called me Cucciolo, little wolf. A beat. She's the only person who's ever called me by an endearment that I didn't want to correct. Fiora was quiet for a moment. My grandmother called me Caramella, little candy. I hated it until she died, and then I wanted nothing more in the world than to hear her say it again. He turned from the stove and looked at her across the kitchen. Something passed between them in the warm, fragrant air. something that was recognition, the specific recognition of two people discovering a shared fluency in grief. He served the pasta himself, cacio e pepe, simple and precisely made, the way simple things always require more skill than complicated ones.
They ate at the kitchen island because the dining table felt too formal, or maybe because the island was where they'd always talked, and rituals accrete without permission. "You never married," she said. "No," he twirled pasta. "My life isn't suitable for that." "You decided that." "Someone would have decided it for me eventually." He said this without self-pity, as a statement of geography. In this world, people close to you are leverage. Every person you love is a potential weapon someone can use against you. She thought about this, thought about what it meant to live at a level of power where care was a vulnerability to be managed. "That's a very lonely way to think about love," she said. "It's an accurate way. It's one way." He looked at her. "You have a relentless habit of arguing with my conclusions. I have a professional habit of examining evidence." She paused. "You're not currently acting like love is only a weapon. This," she gestured at the plates, the wine, the kitchen, "isn't leverage." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it isn't." They looked at each other across the plates and wine glasses and 14 days of accumulated understanding that neither of them had agreed to accumulate. Outside, Chicago was dark and alive, and up here in the penthouse, it was possible to feel as if the city were another country, as if the world that required him to be what he was existed at the other end of an impossible distance. "Nero," she said. "Yes." "If things were different," she stopped. She didn't know how to finish this sentence. More importantly, she didn't know if she should. He finished his wine. "If things were different," he said slowly, "I would have met you in a courtroom or at a party, and I would have found a reason to talk to you, and I would have made a very poor impression, because I am not—" He paused, choosing his words with that careful deliberation she'd come to know. "I don't do this well. The ordinary things, the normal grammar of how people meet." She felt something in her chest do what she recognized as a structural change, the way a room feels different after a piece of furniture has been moved, the same space but differently shaped. "You do this fine," she said quietly. He looked at her. Long, deep, reading her the way he read everything, not extracting data, but actually reading, comprehending, the way you read something that matters. Then he said, "You're not a prisoner." She frowned slightly. You haven't been, for some time." He sat back. "I think you know that." She did know that. She had known it since approximately day 7, when she'd started to understand that what kept her was not the absence of exits, but the presence of something she kept refusing to name. The realization, placed in front of her now in plain language, was both clarifying and terrifying. She was here because some part of her had chosen to be here. And when that part had made its decision, she wasn't sure. "I should be afraid of you," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I'm not." "I know." He said this with something careful in it, something almost tender. "That's what frightens me." The laptop was full of restricted domains and filtered traffic, but it was still a laptop, And Fiora was still a lawyer who had spent 5 years at one of Chicago's sharpest practices, and she had, over the course of 2 weeks, been quietly assembling a picture. The Falcone family, and it was a family, which was how this architecture worked, both by blood and by structure, occupied a specific position in the upper Midwest's organized crime geography. Old money, in the worst sense. This had been built over generations, not acquired overnight. Chicago, parts of Detroit, certain interests in New York that interlocked with older structures from the East Coast. The name Falcone didn't appear in any legal document she could access, which was itself information. Men who left no paper trail were men who had learned at great expense how paper trails were made. She had also assembled, from inference and overheard fragments and the specific vocabulary of the people around her, a clearer picture of what had happened at the Velvet Anchor. The man in the chair had been named Paolo Setti. She'd heard the name once, dropped carelessly in a conversation that swung past her in the hallway. Setti was a mid-level figure in a competing family, the Conti operation, which was currently engaged in some kind of territorial renegotiation with the Falcones. He had been brought to the Velvet Anchor not to be harmed, but to be persuaded. The document Nero had shown her, the financial document, had been part of that persuasion. She had not, in fact, witnessed an assassination. She had witnessed a negotiation conducted in the idiom of men who used coercion as a first language. This did not make any of it legal. This did not make any of it moral. But it changed the shape of things in a way she couldn't entirely ignore, because she had spent 2 weeks calculating herself against the idea of a murderer, and now had to recalculate against something slightly different. A man who operated in violent spaces and used violence's vocabulary, but who had shown her, in 2 weeks of close proximity, a consistency of behavior she had not expected and could not easily dismiss. She told him what she'd worked out on the 15th day, sitting on the terrace in afternoon light that had turned suddenly warm, like the city remembering it had agreed to have a spring. "You weren't going to kill him," she said. Nero, who had come out with 2 coffees, and the posture that indicated he'd intended to sit in comfortable silence, settled into the chair across from her and looked at her without apparent surprise. "No." The document was a confession, something he'd signed. Something he'd already signed, weeks earlier, when he understood that signing it was preferable to the alternatives. He said this with the measured evenness of someone who understood that the alternatives being referenced were real, and that she understood this, and that they were both going to sit with that understanding without flinching away from it. "So the night I walked in," she said, he was being reminded that the confession existed. Reminded and relieved of some additional documentation that he'd been collecting, against his better interest. She drank her coffee, thought about this. The spring-adjacent sun was warm on her face, and somewhere below them the city was living its ordinary life, and she was 2 weeks into a captivity that had become something she didn't have a word for. "Nero," she said, "can I ask you something, and will you actually answer it?" He tilted his head slightly, which meant yes, she'd learned. "Why did you show me the document? That first night? You didn't have to. I would have filled in worse conclusions without it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city rather than her, and she watched his profile, the clean, definite lines of it, the way he held things in rather than outward. "I showed you," he said carefully, "because you were afraid, and I wanted—" He paused, choosing something. I didn't want you to be afraid of something that wasn't what you thought it was. You cared whether I was afraid. Yes. She put her coffee down. Why? He looked at her then. The afternoon light was clear on his face, honest in the way that unforgiving natural light always is, and what she saw in his expression was something she hadn't seen there before, or perhaps had seen and kept refusing to identify. Something wanting. Not in the way of someone accustomed to wanting and getting, but in the way of someone who has kept wanting carefully away from themselves for a long time and felt it resurface without warning. Because you walked into that bar and you were brave and furious, and you kept looking at me like I was a problem you were going to solve, he said. And no one has looked at me like that since my grandmother. A pause. Without fear, without calculation, just, he exhaled, like I was a person who could be argued with. She felt this land, felt it fully, without the buffer of denial she'd been maintaining. You've been alone in this, she said, for a long time. I made choices that required it. That's not the same as wanting it. He said nothing, but his eyes, watching her, were saying everything that his discipline kept from his mouth, a whole conversation in a frequency just below words, and she had, in 15 days, become fluent enough to hear it. She reached across the small table between them and put her hand over his. His eyes dropped to her hand. She felt him, very still, very present, the way the world becomes when something unprecedented happens. Then his hand turned, slow and deliberate, and his fingers closed around hers, and she let them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Because the city was beautiful below them, and the sun was warm, and some things are better held than explained. She kissed him on the 17th day. In her later accounting of it, she was honest with herself. She chose to. It was not an accident, and it was not coercion, and it was not the outcome of any force external to herself. She had been building toward it since approximately the gallery, and she had been honest enough with herself, alone in her room on enough sleepless nights, to know it. It happened in the kitchen, because that was their place. The kitchen, where he made coffee and she pretended to work, and they conducted the running conversation that had no real beginning and didn't need one. She had come in to find him standing at the window, looking at the early evening city, and there was something in the angle of him, the slight bow of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that wasn't ease, but its opposite, that told her he was carrying something heavy. She came and stood beside him, looking at the same view, the lights coming on as the day pulled back, the lake in the distance going dark, the city arranging itself into its nighttime geometry. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "Summit tomorrow. The other families." She'd pieced enough together to understand this. A convergence of the city's power structure, the Falcones, the Contis, others she knew only by inference. High stakes. The culmination, she thought, of everything that had been in motion since the night at the bar. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "No." Said immediately, and she wasn't sure it was entirely true. Prepared. She turned to look at him in profile. He didn't turn. She studied the clean severity of his face, the dark lashes, the slight line between his brows, the set of his jaw that spoke of something held very tightly. She had done this before, this looking. But now she did it without pretending she was doing something else. Nero.
She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, not as an address, but as something else. A calling. He turned, found her already looking at him, and whatever he saw in her face made him very still. She lifted her hand and touched his jaw, just the edge of it, the point where the jaw met the neck, the tips of her fingers on the warm skin of him, and she felt him stop breathing. Fiora. Her name in his voice had a different quality now, not careful, not measured. Something pulled through. I know what this is, she said quietly. I know what all the reasons against it are. I've been making the list for 17 days. And I'm still here. She held his gaze. And I think you know why. He lifted his hand, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that this was a line, and covered her hand where it rested against his jaw, pressed it there. His eyes were very dark, very close. This complicates things, he said. You seem to manage complicated things well. The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile that she had come to understand was one of his most genuine expressions, because it happened in spite of everything. Then he moved, or she did, or they both did simultaneously, the way two things pulled toward the same point eventually close the distance. And then she was kissing him, and his hands were on her face, and the kitchen was bright around them, and the city was dark outside the windows, and everything else, the reasons, the complications, the careful architecture of why this wasn't possible, dissolved into the specific, grounding reality of his mouth on hers. He kissed the way he did everything, fully, without apology, with a quality of attention that made everything else peripheral. She had her hands in his lapels, and he had her face cupped in both his hands, and the world reduced to this specific point of contact, this warmth, this strange, impossible gravity between them. When they separated, neither of them moved far. His forehead against hers, her hands still in his jacket. This is, she said, very quietly, incredibly inadvisable. Yes. He was still holding her face. His thumbs moved very slightly at her temples, a gesture so gentle she almost didn't register it. I want to do it again. I know, he said, and kissed her again. And this time she let herself stop thinking about advisability entirely, and simply stayed, present and choosing, in the warmth of a man she had spent 17 days attempting not to fall for, and had evidently failed at comprehensively. Later they sat on the terrace in the cold, with blankets and wine, and she asked him about Sicily, and he told her things she thought he'd told no one. About his father's disappearance when Nero was 12, about the years after, about how he'd built what he'd built, partly from necessity and partly from anger, and partly from the specific stubbornness of someone who refuses to be unmade by the world. She told him about the DA's office, the years she'd spent believing in institutional justice, and the specific, grinding way that belief had worn thin without quite breaking, until she'd moved to private practice and told herself it was pragmatism rather than disillusionment. You still believe in it, he said. The line, the rules. Yes. She didn't hesitate on this. I do. He looked at her. Even now? Even now. She held his gaze. That doesn't change. I know. he said it simply. It's one of the things I... He stopped. The night was very clear, a cold April clarity. Don't change, he said instead of whatever he'd almost said. But she heard it beneath, the word he'd rerouted around, and she filed it away in the part of herself where she kept the things too important to examine directly. The next morning, he was different. Not cold toward her specifically, but armoured in a way she hadn't seen since the first night. He was in the kitchen when she came down, but the quality of his stillness was not the easy, domestic stillness of the past week. It was the other kind, the readiness of a man preparing for something. He looked at her when she appeared. Something moved in his eyes, warm, quick, and then composited back into the larger stillness. "Today is the summit," she said. "Yes." "Will it resolve the situation? The reason I'm here?" "If it goes as planned." He poured coffee, slid it toward her. "There are variables." She took the coffee, watched him. "What are the variables?" He looked at her steadily. "The Conti family claims to have a witness, someone who can speak to what happened at the Velvet Anchor. They're using it as leverage in the negotiation." She understood what this meant before she'd finished parsing the words. Me. They're claiming to have me as a witness. Claiming, which means either they're bluffing or someone told them I was there. Yes. She set down the coffee. "The person in your organization who told stories they shouldn't have. That situation has been resolved." His voice on resolved had the same quality as when he said contained, the word doing a lot of work that she wasn't going to ask it to unpack. "If they're bluffing," she said, "and you call the bluff, they lose leverage. The negotiation proceeds on terms I can work with. And if they're not bluffing..." He looked at her. The armour was very present, but she had learned his face in 17 days in a way that meant the armour was not entirely opaque to her. She could see what was beneath it. Not fear for himself, something else. "Then it becomes a different kind of meeting," he said. "I'm a variable," she said. Not accusatory, she meant it factually. "You're not..." He stopped himself. The word he'd been about to say was something she could see him decide not to say. Not yet. Not in the middle of a morning that required him to be something other than the man who'd held her face in his hands the night before. "You're not a variable to me," he said instead. "But to the people in that room today, yes. I need you to understand this so that you understand why, today specifically, I need you to be exactly where I can reach you." She nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. "You keep saying that. I keep meaning it." She paused. "Be careful." The armour shifted. Something very private crossed his face, something that she had come to understand was the highest level of feeling this man could express in daylight, in a kitchen, before a meeting that might determine the next phase of his life. "I will be back," he said. "I know." She said it with the certainty she felt. He was gone by 9. She worked. She forced herself to work. The Marchetti case had become, in the context of everything she'd learned, a different kind of document, with different undertones that she had to carefully quarantine from her professional obligations. She was a lawyer. She had a duty to her client. What she knew and what she was allowed to know were two different things, and she was going to have to disentangle them very carefully when she got back to her life. When she got back. She noticed the syntax. When, not if.
At 3 in the afternoon, Rosa brought her tea without being asked. This was unusual. "Is everything all right?" Fiora asked. Rosa's composure was perfect, as always, but she held the teacup slightly longer than she needed to. "These meetings sometimes run long," she said. "How long?" "He's always come back," Rosa said, which was not an answer to the question she'd been asked. Fiora understood what this was. Rosa had worked for this man for how long? She didn't know, but long enough that she'd arranged her emotional economy around his returns and absences with the practiced endurance of someone who'd learned not to count hours. The care in her eyes when she mentioned him was the care of long proximity to a person you've watched navigate a dangerous world. "He's good at what he does," Fiora said. Rosa looked at her with something sharp and warm simultaneously. "Yes," she said, "and he's been better lately." A pause that was not quite weighted with implication. "Sleep is a factor." Fiora didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either, and Rosa's small, precise smile said she'd understood whatever she needed to understand. He came back at 6. She heard the elevator. She'd been in the main room for the past hour, telling herself she was working and managing about 40% effective productivity, and stood when the doors opened. He came in with Marco and one other man she knew by sight, and the three of them were talking low and quick, and she stood in the doorway of the main room and waited. He saw her, stopped talking, crossed to her in 3 strides, and, in front of Marco, in front of the other man, with complete disregard for audience, put one hand on the side of her face and looked at her. She put her hand over his. "You're back." "The situation is resolved," he said. And then, quietly, with a precision that told her he'd been composing this since approximately 3 in the afternoon, "The threat to you has been neutralized. You can leave." She heard this. She processed it. She held his hand against her face for a moment longer. "You said I can leave," she said. "Do you want me to leave?" His eyes. Those dark, careful, entirely unguarded eyes. "No," he said, "I don't want you to leave." She leaned into his hand. "Then I'm not leaving. Not yet." She paused. "But we need to talk about what this actually is. Tonight. Tomorrow. Without—" She glanced at Marco, who was suddenly very interested in his phone. "An audience." "Tomorrow," he agreed, and brought his forehead down to hers, there in the entryway of his apartment, with his colleagues pretending not to watch, and she felt him breathe once, deeply, like a man releasing something he'd been holding all day. She called Asher the next morning. Nero arranged it, handed her a phone, unlocked, without conditions attached, and left the room. She understood what this was, not just access, but trust. A gesture that said, "I'm not managing you." Asher answered on the second ring, and the sound of her voice, bright, familiar, carrying the mild panic of someone whose boss had been unreachable for nearly 3 weeks, made Fiora's eyes sting in a way she absolutely did not permit to proceed further. "Fiora, oh my God, your parents have been calling me." "I'm fine." She made her voice steady. "I'm so sorry, Asher. It was a family situation. It's resolved." This was technically true, in ways she was not going to elaborate on. "How are the cases?" "Manageable, barely. The Marchetti deposition was rescheduled. Opposing counsel was actually understanding, which I've never experienced before. Your father has called 7 times. A pause. "Fiora, are you actually okay?" "I'm actually okay." She looked out the window at the lake, cold and enormous and deeply Chicago. I'm going to take a few more days. Then I'm back. I'll explain what I can. What you can. A careful pause. Okay. Asha was many things, but she was not someone who required information she'd been signalled not to pursue. The Marchetti case. There's a complication you should know about. Someone has been asking questions about the contract, about the family. Someone outside the normal scope. Fiora stilled. What kind of someone? Couldn't get a clear ID. They went through a shell firm. A pause. Fiora, is this related to your family thing? I don't know yet, she said honestly. Keep a record of everything. Send it to my personal email, not the firm account. She hung up and sat with this for a moment. Then she found Nero. He was in the locked study, which today was open. She'd never been inside it, and she took a moment in the doorway to catalogue. Organised chaos of the specific kind that belongs to someone who processes information physically. Papers and folders and a board on the wall with connections mapped in his writing, which was small and very precise. He was on the phone, and he looked up when she appeared, and something in his face shifted toward her automatically, involuntarily. The specific, particular orientation of someone whose attention has found its north. He ended the call. You spoke to your assistant? Someone is asking questions about one of my cases, she said, outside the normal channels. She thinks through a shell firm. She watched his face. Is this related to the summit? He was already thinking she could see it, the way his eyes went slightly internal, running calculations. Possibly. The Conti family was using the bar situation as leverage. If their investigation of the bar led them to you, and you to your clients, he stopped. The Marchetti contract. Are the Marchettis in a dispute that would benefit someone with Conti family connections? She thought about this. She thought about it as a lawyer, quarantining what she could tell him from what she absolutely shouldn't. There's a real estate transaction, she said carefully. Large. The opposing party has interests that I didn't look too closely at. His expression told her he understood what she was carefully not saying. I'll need to look into the opposing party. I can't tell you who they are. I know, he paused, but I might already know anyway. This sat between them, the exact boundary of her world and his, the lines she'd talked about, the rule structure she'd built her life around. She was on one side of it, he was on the other, and they were standing in a doorway together, and neither of them had moved to their respective sides. Nero, she said, when I go back, when I actually go back, not because you need me to, but because I choose to, I have to go back as myself, all of myself, including the parts that will sit across a courtroom from people in your world and try to put them in prison. He looked at her. I know. That includes you, theoretically. Theoretically. Not theoretically. He was very still. She could see him examining this, turning it, looking at all its sides. Yes, he said, not theoretically. She exhaled. That's an impossible situation. It's the honest one. He stood from behind the desk, crossed to her in the doorway and stopped, close, the doorway framing them both, neither fully in nor out. I'm not asking you to change what you are. I never would. Then what are you asking? He raised one hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so simple, so domestic, so catastrophically at odds with the setting and their situation that she felt it as something physical in her chest. I'm not asking anything, he said quietly.
I'm telling you that I am whatever I am, and you are whatever you are, and the space between those things is something I've been thinking about since the night you dropped your phone in a hallway and looked at me like I was the problem you were going to solve. She looked at him. His hand moved from her hair to her jaw, just resting there, warm and present. We can't resolve this, she said. Not today, he agreed. Maybe not ever. Maybe not. He didn't look away. Are you leaving today? She held his gaze for a long time, thought about her apartment, her cat, Asher's voice, the Marchetti deposition, the ordinary structure of her life, and how she had been so certain 3 weeks ago that it was sufficient. Not today, she said. Something in his face, that fractional, devastating shift. The amber in his eyes. Then tomorrow we figure out the Marchetti situation, he said, and the day after that we figure out something else. One day at a time, she said. That's how most things are built. She put her hand on his chest, over the precise center of it, felt his heartbeat, steady, strong, like everything else about him. He covered her hand with his. I'm going to make a lot of trouble for you, she said. I've been told I handle complicated things well, he replied, and she recognized her own words from 2 nights ago and laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of it, and his smile, fully present for once, entirely unguarded, was the most devastating thing she'd seen in 20 days of devastation. The complication arrived 3 days later in the form of a man named Dario Conti. She knew the name from overheard conversations and inference. He was the head of the Conti family's Chicago operation. Second generation, she'd gathered, smarter than his father had been, but less patient, which was its own particular kind of dangerous. He was also, apparently, the person who had sent someone to dig through her client files. She learned this because the someone arrived at the penthouse. Not uninvited, exactly. Nero had been warned, she understood, through the specific intelligence network that she'd stopped trying to understand and simply accepted as operating. The man who arrived was not Dario Conti himself, but his representative, a lawyer, an actual lawyer, which struck her as so deeply ironic that she had to stand in her hallway doorway for a moment, just breathing through it. His name was Tommaso Ferrara, and he was smooth in the way of men who have spent their careers in rooms where 2 conversations are always happening simultaneously. He sat in the main room across from Nero, and Fiora sat in the kitchen within earshot, because Nero had told her quietly, "You should hear this," and so she was there, at the island with a coffee she wasn't drinking, listening. Ferrara explained, in the beautifully precise language of intermediaries, that the Conti family had become aware of her presence in the apartment, that they considered this a sign of bad faith on the part of the Falcone organization, given that Nero had denied any witness at the summit, and that they were prepared to use the information they had about Ms. Esposito's presence at the Velvet Anchor in ways that would be unhelpful for everyone involved. Then Ferrara said, "The family is also prepared to offer the lady protection and transportation from the building if she wishes to leave." There was a pause that had the specific quality of something very controlled. She came out of the kitchen. Both men looked at her. Nero's expression was controlled, almost perfectly, but she had learned his face well enough to see what was behind the control. Something sharp and ready, and also, underneath that, something else that was her name in an expression. Ferrara looked at her with professional assessment. Ms. Esposito, I'm sure this situation has been— I know who you represent, she said. She walked into the room and stood between the two men, not beside either of them. I am familiar with the Conti family's interests, Mr. Ferrara. She kept her voice very even. And I want to be clear about what I witnessed at the Velvet Anchor. Ferrara's attention sharpened. Nero was very still. I witnessed a private meeting, she said. I saw nothing that constitutes criminal activity. I have no testimony to offer anyone, and I will not be providing one. She looked at Ferrara directly. If the Conti family is relying on my cooperation for any legal or extra-legal strategy, they will find themselves disappointed. And if they attempt to compel my cooperation through any means, including the fiction that I'm here against my will, which I am not, they will find that I am a very good lawyer who is very familiar with harassment law. Ferrara looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that was almost respect, filtered through surprise. You're here voluntarily. I'm here voluntarily. She said it clearly, cleanly, and as she said it, she understood that it was not only a tactical statement, but a true one, and that the truth of it had become true somewhere in the last 3 weeks without her explicit permission. And she was at peace with this, which itself was a piece of information she was going to sit with later, in private. Ferrara looked at Nero. Something passed between them in the code that men who live in this world communicate in: assessment, recalculation, the adjustment of strategy. I'll convey Ms. Esposito's position to the family, Ferrara said, standing. Do that, Nero said. After Ferrara left, Nero stood looking at her for a long moment. She looked back. Then he said, You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She sat on the edge of the sofa. He was going to use me as leverage. The only way to remove a piece of leverage is to demonstrate it doesn't work. You're not afraid of them. I'm afraid of what's reasonable to be afraid of, and not afraid of what isn't. She paused, and I don't like being used as a chess piece. He came and sat beside her, close, the easy proximity they had found without deciding to, the default distance of people who have been in one space long enough to understand each other's gravity. They're going to look for other angles, he said. I know. She looked at her hands. Nero, the Marchetti case. I need to look at it with fresh eyes. If the Conti family has been using that contract as a vector for something, you can't tell me client information. I know that. She looked at him. But I can look at it myself. And if I find something, if there's something there that's legitimately problematic, I need to act on it the way I'd act on it as a lawyer. He held her gaze. Even if it implicates people on my side of the line. Even then. She said it steadily because she would not be unsteady on this. You said you'd never ask me to change what I am. I meant it. He didn't hesitate. Look at the case. Do what you need to do. A pause. I'll get you access to whatever you need. She nodded. Then she said, They're going to try again, the Contis. Yes. And you're going to handle it. Yes. In your way, he looked at her. In my way. She breathed through this. The line she lived on, the line she maintained. She was not going to ask him to cross it, and she was not going to cross it herself, and the fact that they could sit side by side on a sofa with the line between them and still be this close was either the most mature arrangement she'd ever arrived at, or the most sophisticated form of self-deception she'd ever practiced. She suspected it was both. She decided to live in it anyway. She found it on the fourth morning after Ferrara's visit. She'd been going through the Marchetti files with the precise, methodical focus she applied to anything she was determined to understand completely, line by line, annotation by annotation, the due diligence records and title searches and corporate disclosures that built the architecture of a large real estate transaction. The opposing party's primary holding company was registered in Delaware, which was not unusual. The beneficial ownership disclosure was minimal, which was also not unusual. But the beneficial ownership disclosure referenced a secondary entity registered in the Cayman Islands, and that entity, when she traced it through the public filings available to her, interlocked with a third entity in which she recognized, not a name exactly, but a pattern, a structure. The specific way that certain funds moved when the people moving them needed them not to be traceable. She sat very still for a long time. She was a good lawyer. She had worked for the DA's office. She knew how to read these structures, and she knew what they meant. And the one thing she was certain of was that her client, the Marchetti family, had entered a real estate transaction with a counterparty that was, at a minimum, using the transaction to move money, and at maximum was doing something significantly worse. The problem was what to do with this. She could not tell Nero. Client confidentiality was not conditional on circumstances. She could not tell him not only because of professional ethics, but because of something more personal. Because she was not going to become someone who used her legal knowledge as currency in his world, and she was not going to do it for him any more than she would do it against him. What she could do was call a colleague. She used the phone Nero had given her, still available, he'd not restricted it since the summit's resolution, and called Mara Chen, her most trusted contact from the DA's office, who was now at a watchdog firm, and who answered with the specific wariness of someone who has learned that calls from former colleagues often come with complications. "Fiora, you've been hard to reach." "Family emergency. Mara, I have a hypothetical." Mara was good at hypotheticals. They talked for 40 minutes, carefully within the specific language of professional privilege and hypothetical scenario, and by the end Fiora had a clearer picture of what she needed to do and a referral to someone at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit who could receive information from a lawyer without requiring immediate disclosure of its source. She found Nero in the study when she was done. "I need to do something," she said, standing in the doorway. "I can't tell you what it is or why, but I need you to understand that it's something I have to do as a lawyer, and it doesn't—" She paused. "It doesn't put you at risk, as far as I can tell." He looked at her from behind the desk, assessed her face. She could see him calibrating the trust question, the control question, the specific difficulty of being a man who managed his world through comprehensive information, being asked to allow a space of deliberate ignorance. "Is it dangerous for you?" he asked. "No, it's administrative." She paused. "It's the right thing to do for my client." A long silence. "All right," he said. She exhaled. "You're not going to ask what it is?" "You told me you can't tell me." He looked at her steadily. "I trust that you have a reason." She stood in the doorway and felt this land, the specific weight of being trusted unconditionally in the middle of everything complicated. She had trusted him too, she realized, not because the situation required it, and not because she had no other option, but because she had looked at the evidence of who he was and made a decision. This was what it was, between them. Not a hostage situation, and not a fantasy, and not any of the clean categories she'd tried to put it in. It was two people who saw each other clearly, across a line that wasn't going anywhere, choosing to stand as close to that line as possible, without asking the other to cross it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." He looked back at his papers. "Come back and tell me about your grandmother." She smiled, fully, the kind of smile that was entirely unguarded, and that she was slowly learning she didn't need to manage around him. "Her name was Caterina," she said, coming into the study, "and she made the best sfogliatelle in all of Napoli, which she was not modest about. She sounds like my grandmother would have liked her. Lucia would definitely have liked her." She sat in the chair across from his desk. They'd have argued about whose pastry was better. He looked up at her. "Lucia's was better. Nonna Caterina would like a word with you about that." And he laughed. Actually, fully laughed. She heard it and felt it as something precious and rare, like weather that happens once in a specific place, and you know it as you're experiencing it, as something you'll remember. It made him look younger. It made him look briefly like the boy who had helped his grandmother make pasta in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and home. She held this like something breakable and bright. The FBI contact called back 2 days later with questions she couldn't answer without further compromise, and she spent a morning in her room on the phone, working through the specific tightrope of what she could disclose, what required a formal filing, and what would trigger obligations that made her position considerably more complicated. By the time she came out, it was afternoon, and Rosa was in the kitchen with an expression Fiora had not seen on her before, something carefully composed in the specific way of someone composing over distress. "What happened?" Fiora asked. Rosa looked at her. A pause. "There was an incident this morning, on the south side." "Nero?" "He's here. He's fine." Rosa said this quickly, which meant she'd heard the specific pitch of Fiora's voice. "But one of his men was... It's serious, and Mr. Conti has made a statement." "What kind of statement?" "He's claiming the summit agreement was made under false pretenses, that the Falcone family misrepresented. He's claiming your testimony was suppressed, that you were held against your will, and that what happened at the bar was..." Rosa stopped. "That it was what?" Fiora kept her voice even. "That it was a murder, not a negotiation." Rosa met her eyes. "He's saying Nero killed Paolo Setti." Fiora sat down at the kitchen island. She thought about the night at the bar, the room, the man in the chair, the hand reaching into the jacket. She thought about the document Nero had shown her. She thought about what she'd heard through the glass. Paolo Setti. "Is Setti dead?" she asked. Rosa was quiet for a moment. "He died 3 days ago. An accident." She processed this. An accident. That is what the investigation concluded. Rosa's voice was very careful. Fiora put both hands flat on the cool marble and thought. She was a lawyer. She understood what evidence was. She understood what she had witnessed, what she could prove she had witnessed under oath. She understood the difference between what she believed and what she could demonstrate. She understood that Paolo Setti, alive when she'd last seen him, might have met any number of ends in the 3 weeks since, and that the chain of causation between what she'd witnessed at the bar and what happened to him afterward was not something she could establish. She also understood that Nero had told her the man was alive, and that there was a difference between a negotiation and what came after it.
and that she had been in this apartment long enough to know a thing or two about how his world worked, and that knowing did not mean approving. She found him in the study. He looked up when she came in, and he saw her face, and something shifted in his. "The incident this morning," she said, "and Seti." "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." She stayed in the doorway, aware that the doorway was a kind of threshold. "Tell me the truth." He put down what he was holding, looked at her steadily. "What you saw at the bar was what I told you, a negotiation. Seti was unharmed when he left." "And after?" A pause that had weight. "After is a different question." She held his gaze. "Did you order it?" He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face, the control of it, the precise management of every muscle and angle. But she knew this face now. She could see into the margins of it. "No," he said. "I didn't order it." She breathed. "But it happened in your world." "Yes." "And you knew it might." Longer pause. "I knew there were people who believed Seti was a liability. I had—" He stopped. "I had taken steps to prevent it. I was not entirely successful." She turned this over. She believed him, not because she wanted to, but because she had watched him lie, or rather had watched him not lie, and she understood his relationship with truth was particular and precise in the same way his relationship with most things was. He said what he meant, and he did not say what he did not mean, and what he omitted and what he stated were both deliberate. "Conti is going to use this," she said. "Yes. He's going to try to use me to use this against you." "He'll try." She stood in the doorway and looked at the man across the desk, the man who had made her coffee for 20 days and read The Leopard on the sofa and laughed at something she'd said about her grandmother's pastry and held her face with the hands of someone afraid of breaking something already precious to him. "I can't protect you from a legal case," she said. "I want you to understand that. If there is a legal case to be made, I know. My obligation, I know what your obligations are, Fiora." He said her name with the specific weight he always gave it. "I've never asked you to violate them." "I know you haven't." She exhaled. I need to say it out loud. Because I need you to know that if it comes to that, I know." He stood, crossed to her, stopping just at the threshold. "I knew who you were from the first night. The kind of person who tells the truth even when it costs something." He paused. "It's one of the things—" He stopped himself the way he sometimes did, pulling something back before it fully emerged. She finished it for him anyway, quietly. "I know." He looked at her. His hand came up to her hair, the familiar gesture, tucking it back, a gesture that had become a ritual, that had become a language. "We're going to have to be very careful," she said. "We're going to have to be very careful," he agreed, "and we're going to have to trust each other." "I do," she said. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "Neither do I," he said, with the honesty of someone acknowledging a country he'd never intended to live in. "But here we are." "Here we are," she said. She had been in the penthouse for 23 days when Dario Conti's people made their move. She was on the terrace. Spring had decided to arrive properly now, the lake sending something almost warm toward the building, the city softening at its edges, when Marco appeared with an expression that compressed 20 minutes of information into a look.
"We have a situation," he said. The situation was someone had gone to the Chicago Tribune with a story. An anonymous source. The story was that Fiora Esposito, attorney at law, had been held against her will in the penthouse apartment of Nero Falcone, known Chicago crime figure, and that she was being used to obstruct a witness in a federal investigation. The story was not accurate in any of its particulars, and it would still, she understood, be deeply damaging to everyone involved. Nero was already on the phone when she came inside. 2 phones, actually, one in each hand, the kind of multitasking that looked impossible, but that she'd seen him do before when things were moving quickly. He saw her and said into one of the phones, "Hold," and said to her, "You've seen?" "I've seen." She was already thinking, already building the counter-framework. "I need my phone, my actual phone, not the restricted one." He looked at her for a half-second, then nodded to Marco, who disappeared. "My firm is going to be called for comment," she said. "Before they call me, I need to call them. I need to control that narrative." She was walking while she talked, moving through the main room in the way she moved through a courtroom, focused, directional, assembling. "I also need you to understand that I'm going to tell my firm the truth." He was watching her. How much truth? That I was a witness to something at the Velvet Anchor, that the situation was handled, that I have been here voluntarily for the last 3 weeks. She looked at him. "That is all true." "Yes." "It also tells a story that I understand what story it tells." He met her eyes. "Tell it. Tell the truth." She held his gaze. Then Marco appeared with her actual phone, her phone, with the cracked corner of the case where she'd dropped it 6 months ago, the contact list and the notes and the 23 days of missed, ordinary life. And she turned it on and waited for it to come back to itself. 12 missed calls from her parents, 27 from the firm, 49 from numbers she didn't recognize. She called the managing partner first. It was the hardest call she'd made in years, not because Mitchell was unkind about it, but because he was kind, professionally concerned, and she could hear beneath his composure the very legitimate worry that one of his associates had been involved in something that could damage the firm. She told him what she could. She was clear on what she had witnessed, what she had not witnessed, and what her voluntary presence in this apartment meant for the narrative. There was a long silence after she finished. Then Mitchell said, "Are you safe now? Are you currently in danger?" "No," she said. "I'm safe." "Is there someone there?" Another pause. "Someone who... Are you being coerced into this conversation?" She looked through the glass at Nero, who was across the room on his own phone, not looking at her, giving her distance, the space to make this call without his presence pressuring it. "No," she said. "No one is coercing me." She spent 2 hours on the phone. By the end of it, she had spoken to the managing partner, to the firm's own PR representative, to Asher, and briefly, painfully, to her mother, who cried in Neapolitan dialect and who Fiora promised in the same dialect was going to be told everything when there was more everything to tell. Nero was sitting in the main room when she came out, just sitting, no book, no phone, no newspaper, just sitting and looking at the city. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "How bad?" he asked. "Manageable," she exhaled. The Tribune is going to run with or without my comment, but the story they have is thin without any corroboration. If I give a statement, which I will, it changes the shape of it significantly. What will you say? The truth, simplified, she paused. That I witnessed a private meeting of ambiguous character, that the parties involved took appropriate steps to manage the situation, and that I have been residing voluntarily at this location during the resolution of the related circumstances. He was quiet for a moment. That's very good. I know. She looked at her hands. It's also true. Is it? He asked it carefully. The appropriate steps part. She considered. You didn't hurt me. You arranged my work to continue. You explained the situation rather than keeping me ignorant. You told me when I could leave. She paused. There are things I'm not including in the statement, but what I'm including is true. He turned to look at her. Something in his face, that quality of being seen, which was different from being observed. She had given him something by saying these words, she understood. Not cover, not strategy, but acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who chooses to emphasize the truth that is also fair. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I know. She looked back at the city. I wanted to. They sat there for a while. The afternoon light was slant and golden, the best kind of Chicago light, and the Tribune would run its story tomorrow, and there would be more calls and possibly more complications, and she was going to have to make decisions about the Marchetti case that were going to require everything she had. But right now, this afternoon, she was here. She had chosen to be here. His hand found hers on the sofa cushion between them, and she let their fingers lace together, and the city was enormous and indifferent outside the glass, and in here, in this gilded space between worlds, she was exactly where she was. The Tribune ran the story on a Thursday. It was smaller than she'd feared, a single column, without her photograph, though a stock image of a downtown law office was presumably meant to do similar work. Citing an anonymous source familiar with the situation, who claimed that a prominent attorney had been present during a disputed incident and had subsequently remained in the company of a known organized crime figure. Her statement was included in full, which was what she'd worked for. The response from her professional world was swift, mixed, and ultimately survivable. Mitchell called at 8 in the morning. It's going to be fine, he said, in the tone of someone who has assessed a situation thoroughly and chosen to believe his own assessment through an act of will. Half the city's lawyers have done stranger things. The statement is good. I want you back in the office Monday. I'll be there Monday, she said. She sat with this for a moment after the call. Monday. 4 days. The specific shape of returning to her life, her apartment, her cat, the commute, the office, the long sequential days of work and structure and purpose, took on a clarity it hadn't had in 3 weeks. She told Nero at breakfast. He had made coffee and eggs. He cooked more than she'd expected, quietly and well, in the way of someone who found the activity grounding. And he listened to her say it with the full stillness of someone receiving information they've been waiting for and preparing for, and still find difficult when it arrives. Monday, he said. Yes. He put down his coffee. Looked at the window rather than her for a moment, the lake clear and enormous in the morning light. I want to say something, he said. She waited. I've been thinking about what comes after this, he said. About what we would be outside of this apartment, outside of the specific situation.
He paused. I don't have a framework for it. Neither do I. She kept her voice steady. There's no manual for this. No, he looked at her. But I don't want it to end here. With you leaving and both of us going back to our respective sides of a line that neither of us chose. He said it carefully, not dramatically, the way he said most important things, as a statement of facts rather than a performance of feeling. It's not going to be easy, she said. No. There will be conflicts, cases, things where what you do and what I do are directly opposed. I know. I will not compromise myself for you. She said this cleanly, needing it said. Not for anyone. That's not who I am. I know who you are. He met her eyes. I know because you told me. The second day you were here, when you looked at me across a kitchen island and said, I am going to find a way out of this. You have been you, consistently, the entire time, even when being you was inconvenient for both of us. Something moved in his expression, the full warmth of it, uncalibrated. I don't want you to be anyone else. She looked at him. 23 days of knowing him, of maps made from fragments, evidence assembled from observation, the specific, strange, detailed intimacy of forced proximity that had become something else entirely. I want to see you, she said. After Monday, when I'm back in my life and you're back in yours. Yes. Immediate, no hesitation. It's going to be complicated, he said. Yes, I live in complicated. A pause. So do you, I've noticed. She laughed. The morning light was clean on the marble of the kitchen island, and his hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, and 23 days were behind them, and everything else was ahead, and she was not afraid of it. I have one condition, she said. Name it. Honesty. She held his gaze. I need to know when there are things you're not telling me. Not the content. I understand there are things I can't know and shouldn't know. But I need to know the shape of what's withheld. I need to know when to not ask. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him measuring this, taking it seriously, understanding what she was actually asking, not for transparency, which wasn't possible, but for the specific kind of honesty between people who live in different worlds and choose each other anyway. Yes, he said, I can do that. And in return, she said, when I'm working on something that creates a potential conflict, I will tell you the same. Not the content, the shape. He nodded slowly. That's... yes. She reached across the island, put her hand over his on the coffee cup. He turned his hand immediately, the way he'd learned to, the way she'd learned he would, fingers closing around hers with the specific warmth that had become as familiar as anything in her life. Monday, she said. Monday, he agreed. And Tuesday? Something shifted in his face, that smile, the real one, the one that changed everything. Tuesday I would like to take you to dinner. Somewhere that isn't this kitchen. A pause. Somewhere public. She registered what this meant in his world, the deliberate choice of visibility, of presenting her in a setting where the gesture was legible to people who read his gestures for meaning, a declaration of something, not a secret. Somewhere with very good pasta, she said. I know a place. Of course you do.
She squeezed his hand, sat for a moment in the warmth of the kitchen and the morning and the specific, unlikely gift of this person looking at her across a counter with everything he was in his eyes. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm glad I dropped my phone." He looked at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "so am I." She left on a Sunday morning. Rosa packed the clothes, her original clothes, cleaned and pressed, returned as if the past 24 days had been a very strange hotel stay, along with several items from the wardrobe that Rosa said were purchased for you anyway, in a tone that did not invite argument. Her bag was returned, her keys, her phone with its cracked case and its backlog of ordinary life waiting to be resumed. She stood in the main room while the bag was brought to the elevator, and she looked at the apartment. The Persian rugs, the books with their worn spines, the terrace where she had mapped the city from a distance for 3 weeks, the kitchen counter where she had eaten breakfast with the most dangerous and most human man she'd ever met. The room held the shape of what had happened in it, the way rooms do. The angles of furniture, the quality of light, the specific silence of a space that had witnessed something. Nero walked her to the elevator. They stood in front of the closed doors, and he was in his customary dark clothes with his customary precise stillness. But the stillness was different today. Charged, controlled, containing something that required containment. "My number," he said, and gave her a card, plain white, nothing but a phone number. She took it and put it in her coat pocket. Their fingers brushed. "The public phone," he said. "There's another one for—" He paused. "For when things are complicated." "How will I know when to use which?" "The first one is for dinner on Tuesday." A pause. "The second one is for when someone tries to kill me." She looked at him. "Has that happened recently?" "Several times. I'm still here." "I notice." She held his gaze. Nero. His name in her mouth still felt like something she'd chosen. "Yes. When things get difficult, and they will get difficult, I know. I need you to tell me, not manage me. Tell me." She paused. "You've been very good at managing the people around you. I don't want to be managed." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, the full, unguarded version of him that she'd seen in pieces and accumulated over 24 days into a portrait she held very carefully inside herself. "I know," he said. "I'll learn. I'm told I'm capable of learning." "Who told you that?" "You, several times," she smiled. She stepped toward him and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, the gesture that had become theirs, checking for presence, for the steady reality of him. His hand covered hers. "Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday." He pressed her hand once against his chest. 8 o'clock. I'll send a car. I can take a cab. I know you can. He kept her hand covered with his. "Let me send a car." She looked at him, understood that this was him, too, the specific language of care he'd learned in a world where care came in forms like security and presence and the certainty of arrival. She could insist on a cab, or she could understand what the car meant. "Fine," she said. "Send a car." Something in his face, the amber of his eyes in the morning light. She would carry this, she knew, this specific image, this moment at the threshold between what the last 24 days had been and whatever came after. The way he looked at her, as if she were something he had not expected and was not yet fully reconciled to deserving. She pressed up and kissed him, brief, certain, a kiss that was a statement rather than a question. Felt his hand come up to her hair, the automatic gesture, the language between them. When she stepped back, his eyes were very dark. 24 days, she said. 24 days, he agreed. We'll see what we can do with the rest. She picked up her bag and stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, and she descended through the building and out into the brilliant April morning. Chicago was very loud. She'd forgotten, or the contrast of it was newly sharp after 3 weeks of penthouse silence and filtered air and the specific soundscape of a high, contained world. The traffic was real. The wind off the lake was real, cold and immediate, cutting through the wool of her coat. A cab splashed through a puddle, and someone on the corner was arguing on their phone, and a delivery truck was blocking the corner, and all of it was ordinary and overwhelming and absolutely, precisely real. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She had a deposition to prepare for. She had client calls to make, and a partner to reassure, and a cat to feed, and an apartment that was probably a disaster, and 3 weeks of ordinary life to resume. She had a financial crimes referral to finalize, and a Marchetti situation to disentangle, and the Dario Conti problem, which was not resolved, which would require attention. She had, she was discovering, a life that was considerably more complicated than it had been on the Tuesday night 3 weeks ago when she ducked into a bar to avoid the rain. She thought about what he'd said on the 14th day, 1 day at a time. That's how most things are built. She flagged a cab, gave her address, let the city close around her, the noise and motion and ordinary beautiful chaos of it, and took out her phone and started, one by one, the calls that would begin the business of putting her life back together. The card with his number was in her coat pocket. She touched it once through the fabric, steady and present and real. She had always been good at building things, from argument and evidence and the careful accumulation of fact. She had built a career from it, a professional identity, a way of being in the world that had structure and purpose and direction. She was going to have to build something else now, something that didn't have a precedent in any of the frameworks she'd been given. Something that existed in the space between her world and his, between law and the absence of it, between the careful, visible structure of the rule of law and the invisible structure of something older and darker, and also, she was honest with herself, not without its own code. It was going to be complicated. She was, it turned out, not afraid of complicated. 3 months later. The restaurant was small, not showy, the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself, because everyone who needed to know already did. She arrived at 8, which was intentional, which was her establishing a grammar of arrival that was neither waiting for him nor being waited for. He was already there. He rose when she came in, not for show. She'd learned this was simply how he was, a formality so habitual it had become reflex. And she crossed the room and sat across from him, and they looked at each other, across a table set with white cloth and good glassware, and the accumulated weight of 3 months of navigation. 3 months of Tuesday dinners, some with the public phone and some with the other one. 3 months of her professional life reassembling itself. The Marchetti situation resolved through a federal referral that had nothing directly to do with the Falcone family and everything to do with the Conti organization's use of legitimate financial structures for illegitimate ends. 3 months of Dario Conti's strategic withdrawal from his Chicago positions, partly as a result of the FBI investigation, and partly, she was honestly unsure how or why, from other pressures she had not asked to understand. 3 months of phone calls at odd hours, of him sending things without notes, a book she'd mentioned wanting, a bottle of wine she'd said she liked, once, bewilderingly, a small potted herb for her kitchen that she'd had to call Rosa to understand was rosemary, because the penthouse kitchen had rosemary, and he'd noticed she always touched it. 3 months of being someone she hadn't been before, more alert, more present, more conscious of the difference between the life she'd been living and a life that was actually lived. "You look well," he said. "You look like yourself," she said, which was her way of saying the same thing differently. He poured the wine himself. He always poured the wine himself, everywhere, which told you everything you needed to know about how he'd learned to trust service. And she watched his hands, which she had memorized by now, the precise way he held things. "My lawyer," he said, with a quality that was not possessive but something else, a specific warmth that she had come to understand meant something that he had not yet said in words. "I'm not your lawyer," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are decidedly not my lawyer." He held her gaze. "You're something I don't have a word for." She smiled. "Work on it." "I have been." He lifted his glass. "It's a work in progress." "I know the feeling." She lifted hers. "To complicated things." "To complicated things," he said. They touched glasses and drank, and outside Chicago moved in its permanent, magnificent motion, and the restaurant was warm, and across the table from her was a man who had started as the worst mistake she'd ever made, and had become something she was still finding language for. Something that had no clean category, but that was present and real and chosen by both of them every day. That was, she had decided, enough. More than enough. It was the right amount. She set down her glass and picked up the menu and said, "Tell me what's good." And he told her. Some things cannot be categorized. Some doors once walked through revealed that the room beyond them was larger than the one you came from. Some people arrive in your life as accidents, a dropped phone, a rainstorm, a wrong turn into a bar that was never the right bar, and become, through the strange alchemy of time and truth and choosing, the most deliberate thing you've ever known. Fiora Esposito was a lawyer who believed in rules. She still does. She has simply learned that some things live in the space between rules. Real things, alive things, things that require their own kind of structure and their own kind of courage. She is still building it. So is he. That's the work